In this video, we're going to acknowledge the fact that when we make a decision in a hypothesis test, we could be wrong. And so we're going to look at the types of errors that can occur after a decision is made in a hypothesis test. And to kind of help us understand what's happening with these errors, we're going to return to our analogy that conducting a hypothesis test is kind of like putting a defendant on trial for some sort of crime. So we've used this analogy throughout as we try to gain understanding of what a hypothesis test is doing. But just a couple of things here. Let's remember that, of course, in our system of justice, all defendants are innocent until proven guilty, okay, beyond a reasonable doubt. And so remember that we're going to start off with the idea, right, that our defendant is innocent, and this is our null hypothesis. So whenever we're thinking about the null hypothesis, we want to think, okay, the defendant's innocent in my analogy. All right, and it's the prosecutor's job to convince the jury to reject the null hypothesis, right? And so the prosecutor's hypothesis is, of course, that the defendant is guilty, and so guilt is our alternative hypothesis. All right, so let's think about the four things that can happen as a result of a trial, right? So first of all, we could convict an innocent defendant, which would of course be very bad, right? We do not want to convict innocent people, and so that would definitely be a type of error. So in our analogy, convicting an innocent defendant would mean that we've rejected the null hypothesis that they're innocent, even though they actually are. So this is what we refer to as a type 1 error, okay? So a type 1 error is rejecting a true null hypothesis, right? So that's one type of error that can occur. And then, of course, the other type of error that can occur in a trial would be that you acquit a guilty defendant, right? So you let a guilty defendant off. And, of course, that's not good either, and so we call that a type 2 error. So in the context of our hypotheses, that means that we did not reject the null hypothesis, right? We did not reject that, even though the null hypothesis was false. So a type 2 error is that we fail to reject a false null hypothesis. So there are, of course, two other outcomes that could happen, right? We could acquit an innocent defendant. We definitely want to do that. And that would mean that we fail to reject the null hypothesis when, in fact, the null hypothesis was true. Or we could convict a guilty defendant, and that means that we did reject the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis was, in fact, false. All right, so those, of course, are both correct decisions. All right, so these type 1 and type 2 errors, we need to be aware that they could occur, and we also need to understand what are the consequences of committing each type of an error. So first of all, let's go revisit the type 1 error for just a moment. Remember that a type 1 error is saying that we have rejected a true null hypothesis. Now, that probability that we do that is actually alpha. And remember, alpha is our level of significance. So when we talked about level of significance in our examples that introduced hypothesis testing, what we said was it's basically the chances we're willing to live with of rejecting a true null hypothesis. So a way that we could restate that is that the level of significance are the chances of making a type 1 error. Okay, now the thing to understand is if we want to make it harder to make a type 1 error, we can do that by changing our level of significance to be smaller. So that way this evidence has to be stronger in order for us to reject our null hypothesis. Okay, but by doing that, we have to understand that we automatically make the chances of having a type 2 error bigger. So we can't eliminate the possibility of making an error, right? By reducing the chances of a type 1 error, we, by definition, increase the chances of a type 2 error and vice versa. All right, so to kind of help us understand this idea a little bit better, we're going to look at a couple of examples where we're not going to do any computations or anything, but we're going to kind of just keep in mind, I think, this analogy, especially in this first example, of we're putting someone on trial, right? And the null hypothesis is innocence, and the alternative hypothesis is guilt. So in this example, it says a student has been accused of cheating on an examination by copying another student's paper. And you have been asked to serve on the panel that must decide the student's fate. If the student is found guilty, he will fail the course. All right, so first of all, what are the null and alternative hypotheses for this situation? So again, the null hypothesis is the innocence hypothesis. So we would start out by saying this person's innocent until proven guilty. So we would say the student did not cheat. And our alternative hypothesis would be just the opposite of that, which would be that the student did cheat. Okay, now, what is a type 1 error in this situation, right, within context, and what are its consequences? Okay, so remember, type 1 error is that you reject a true null hypothesis, right? The null hypothesis is true, and yet you reject it on the basis of the evidence you collected. So what does it mean? Well, you would be rejecting this null hypothesis here, right? So you would be then concluding, right? Concluding the student cheated, right? So rejecting the hypothesis of innocence. But the fact that it's an error means, well, the null hypothesis was actually true. So we'd say when he did not. Okay, which would of course be a very bad thing, right? So concluding the student cheated when in fact he did not. So a type 2 error, remember what that is. That is failing to reject, okay? But it's a false null hypothesis, right? We want to reject false null hypotheses. So a type 2 error would be failing to do so when it is in fact false. So here we would be not concluding the student cheated, okay? So we didn't conclude the student cheated when, in fact, he did. Okay? So those are the two types of errors that could, of course, occur here. And again, when we're trying to decide at what level of, at what degree of evidence is it enough, right, to reject the null hypothesis, it's going to depend on our at least implicit calculation of how serious each of those errors are. So in part D, which of the errors is more serious? Okay. Well, of course, you all as students would say a type 1 error would be more serious here, right? Saying that the student cheated when he didn't. And of course, I would agree with you here, yes. I would say a type 1 error is definitely more serious. And you just think about it this way, right? If we conclude the student cheated when he didn't, then you give the student an F in the class and it is not justified. I mean, that's really unjust, right? Of course, that doesn't mean a type 2 error isn't bad as well, right? What does a type 2 error mean? That a student gets away with cheating. So I would probably say something to the effect of like a type 2 error for the individual is probably not quite as serious as type 1 error. Obviously, if you have student after student after student getting away with cheating, then that becomes a real problem for the institution, right? Because then all of a sudden, the credibility of their degree comes into question. So it's not that a type 2 error doesn't matter, it matters a lot, but for especially this individual instance, we would say a type 1 error is more serious. All right, so one more example like this, and I would encourage you to maybe pause and see if you can fill out A, B, and C yourself without looking at my solution, and then unpause and see how we match up with that. All right, so we have Diana. She was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is a long-term syndrome of body pain, and was prescribed antidepressants. So being the skeptic that Diana is, she didn't initially believe that antidepressants would help her symptoms. So let's write the null and alternative hypotheses in words for Diana's skeptical position. So let's first of all remember that the skeptical position is our null hypothesis, right? We've used that as a key phrase before, the skeptical position. And so what is Diana skeptical of, right? She's skeptical that these antidepressants could actually help her, right? So we'll say that the null hypothesis, like her starting assumption, is that the antidepressants do not help her symptoms. Okay, so that's her starting assumption because she's skeptical of these new drugs she's taking. So the alternative hypothesis would be, of course, the opposite. So the antidepressants do help her symptoms. So, what's a type 1 error in this context? And what is its effect? Of course, remember that means to reject a true null hypothesis. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if she's rejecting this, that means she's concluding that they do help, right? So she concludes the antidepressants help. They help her symptoms. Okay, so that's her rejecting the null hypothesis. But then what does it mean that this is an error? Well, when they actually don't. They don't in reality. Okay, so what is the effect of this? Well, the effect is that she's going to continue to take the medication, right? She will continue with the medication needlessly. And I would say there's two main things that jump out here. She will continue with medication needlessly, right, at least for a while. Right, and why is that so bad? Well, for one thing, subjecting her to possible side effects. okay? And causing her to miss out on medications that will work. Or medications that at least potentially will work. Because if she's taking that, she probably won't be taking anything else. So how could this happen? I mean, if she if there was some other reason why her symptoms were improving, like, for example, fibromyalgia, pain can tend to come and go and at times. And so if she just happened to be in kind of a better period of pain and moving into that, about the same time she started taking the antidepressants, she might attribute her symptom relief to those antidepressants, at least for a while, and mistakenly think that the antidepressants are helping. All right, what about a type 2 error? Okay, well, a type 2 error in this case would be failing to reject a false null hypothesis. And so what would that mean here? So she doesn't reject this starting assumption of hers when it in fact was false. So that means she does not conclude the antidepressants help her symptoms. When, in fact, they do. All right, and so what's the consequence of that, right? The effect is that, of course, she's going to miss out, right? So miss out on symptom relief, ultimately. You might wonder, okay, how in the world could this happen? Well, suppose, for example, that she, kind of the opposite of the last scenario, where she is her fibromyalgia is really kicking in at the moment that she starts taking the antidepressants, or at least once the antidepressants are about to go into effect. And so her pain would have been much worse without them, but the fact that the pain's still there, she says, okay, this isn't working, when in fact they were really helping to keep things under control. So that could happen. Of course, antidepressants can take quite a while to build up in the system, and so maybe she didn't try them for long enough, right? So different ways that that error could happen, but if she makes it, will definitely miss out on symptom relief. So you're going to have some different scenarios like these two examples to kind of work through in your homework. And so hopefully you'll find it helpful to kind of really wrap your brain around what's happening with the type 1 error, what's happening with the type 2 error, and what do we need to be thinking about in terms of how serious each of the errors are. And depending on how serious each of the errors are, how can that help inform how we set up our hypothesis tests? In particular, should that change the level of significance that we set? So remember, if my type 1 error would be really, really serious, then that's when I would make that level of significance a lot smaller. If the type 1 error is not as serious, then you maybe allow that level of significance to be a little bit larger so that it would be easier to reject a null hypothesis.